The Texas sun didn't rise so much as it stomped across the sky, scattering summer heat over Weatherford's rolling fields and rusted fences. On auction days, the stockyard hummed with a low tension. Boots scuffed dust. Men in ball caps or battered cowboy hats eyed the pens and their contents, cattle and sheep shuffling beneath patchy shade. The air thickened with sweat and the sense of manure, diesel, and stale coffee. But above it all was the restless anticipation of the unknown. Whoa, what would go cheap? What would surprise? What stories would get bought and sold right alongside the livestock? Meredith Lane stepped out of her old Subaru, camera bags slung over her shoulder, and paused to draw a breath that didn't quite fill her. She was here for the color, the drama. Her project had started as a distraction, something to keep her moving since Sam's funeral, when the world seemed to close in and everything familiar became unrecognizable. The farmhouse out on Route 12 was too quiet now. The walls echoed. Her mother's old knickknacks and her own half-packed boxes filled the corners with ghosts. The auction was her excuse to leave the house, to pretend she was working, to remind herself that rural Texas was still full of life, even if hers had been put on pause. She moved through the crowd, snapping candid shots. A wiry rancher's face lined like a map of dry creek beds, a boy holding his father's hand, eyes wide as a lamb was pulled from a truck bed. Laughter spiked at the feed stand. Her thumb brushed the camera's worn grip, a nervous habit, and for a moment she let herself drift, until the announcement blared through the loudspeaker, tinny and impatient. Lot 39, German Shepherd, male, approx. 6 years. Last call. Bidding starts at $40. Something about the words, maybe it was the tired edge in the auctioneer's voice, or maybe it was the way the crowd shifted and stilled, made Meredith look up from her lens. Lot 39. The number meant nothing to her. The breed, though, she'd grown up with shepherds. Loyal, stubborn. She edged closer to the pen, her curiosity sharper than she'd admit. Inside the chain-link enclosure, separated from the chaos by just a few feet of space and a warped panel of plywood, lay a German shepherd. He wasn't the biggest she'd ever seen, but there was a density to him, thick neck, heavy chest, ears like radar. His coat was a patchwork of black and tan, ragged along one flank where fur had been shaved and never grown back right. He didn't cower, but he didn't stand. He simply watched. The auctioneer, a man with a faded tan line where his watch should have been, caught her eye. He's a tough case, ma'am. Damaged. We'd animal control picked him up, limping near the old Booker place. Can't say how he got like that, but he's not been mean. Just, still. A woman behind Meredith, maybe 60, hissed a whisper to her companion. That one's got the bad eye. Never blinks. You don't want him? Could be rabid. Meredith's gut twisted. She knew that tone. Fear, pretending to be concern. She stepped closer, crouching so the dog could see her face. The shepherd didn't growl, didn't flinch. He blinked once. His eyes, one amber and the other clouded but keen, tracked her. There was a kind of waiting there, a wariness she recognized in herself. Is he chipped? She asked. The auctioneer shrugged. Didn't say. Paperwork's a mess. Most folks pass him over. Been here 3 auctions now. A skinny man in overalls tossed a half-hearted bid. 30, take him off your hands. The auctioneer shot him a glare. Reserves 40, Earl. Last call, 40 or back to the shelter. Meredith reached into her purse, surprised at her own decisiveness. I'll take him, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Full price. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose, and for a heartbeat the whole ring seemed to quiet. Even the dog, no, she corrected herself, the dog, especially, seemed to focus on her as if the words mattered in a way no one else understood. Your funeral, lady, the man behind her muttered. She ignored him, stepping up to sign the slip, her hands shaking with the old ache of adrenaline. The volunteer brought the leash, but the dog, Lot 39, didn't fight it. He simply stood, slow and deliberate, as if remembering how legs were supposed to work. When he reached her, He stopped and waited, neither eager nor fearful. She knelt again, reaching out with one hand. "Hey there," she whispered. "You and me both, huh?" He sniffed her palm, his breath hot and uncertain. She could see now the old scars beneath the fur, the dullness in his coat, the wounds that told stories no one here cared to read. The walk to her car felt longer than the drive out had been. Meredith glanced around, expecting someone to try and talk her out of it, to ask her if she was sure. No one did. The lot was already moving on. The next animal paraded out, the crowd's attention shifting like wind through tall grass. She opened the passenger door and guided him in, laying an old blanket across the seat. He hesitated, then, with an effort that looked like resignation more than trust, climbed inside. She caught his name on the paperwork. No name. Just male, approx. 6 years. She would fix that, she promised herself. Names mattered. Before pulling away, she looked at him, now her dog, whether he believed it or not. He stared out the window, silent and unmoving, but not gone. Watching, waiting. Meredith felt a hair rise on her arms, the prickle of anticipation that came when a story's first chapter closed and another began. The mystery nagged at her, a splinter she couldn't ignore. What had happened to this dog? Why did he seem so battered, yet so stubbornly present, as if daring the world to try and forget him? As she drove toward her parents' neglected farmhouse, past fields scorched gold and lonely mailboxes leaning in the sun, Meredith felt the old ache in her chest. Grief, hope, fear, twist into something new. She didn't have a plan. Not yet, but she had a wounded dog, a camera, and the stubborn, foolish urge to see things through. Lot 39 lay curled on the seat, his good eye fixed on the horizon. Neither of them knew what waited ahead. But in that uneasy Texas summer, the line between rescuing and being rescued had never been so thin. The drive from Weatherford back to the farmhouse felt longer than usual, the kind of silence that stretches out between two beings still learning to trust. The German Shepherd, her German Shepherd now, sat quietly in the passenger seat, his presence filling the Subaru more than his actual size. Meredith glanced over at him every so often, catching the way his good eye flicked to the side, always tracking her, even in stillness. In the sunlight, the jagged scars along his flank looked raw and honest, like old battles that had faded, but never really healed. The old Lane farmhouse stood at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by fields that hadn't been mowed in years, wildflowers tangled with stubborn weeds, and fence lines sagging under the weight of a dozen Texas summers. Paint peeled from the siding, and the porch steps groaned when Meredith climbed them, arms loaded with groceries and the same camera she never left behind. It was a place heavy with memory, a place she'd hoped might help her heal after Sam died, though most days it just felt empty, like someone had taken the heart out of the house and left only the bones. She parked the car in the shade of the lone pecan tree and let the shepherd out first. He hesitated, paws on the gravel, nose twitching as he took in the new scents: wild mint, old wood, a faint trace of fox that haunted the barn at night. He didn't bolt, didn't pull on the leash, just stood there, a silent, unmoving sentry. "Come on," she coaxed softly. "Let's see if we can make this place work for both of us." Inside, the air was cool, tinged with the scent of lemon cleaner and dust. Meredith had spent the last few weeks scrubbing, packing away her mother's knickknacks, trying to make space for her own grief. She had left the doors open, hoping the house would air out some of its sadness, but it always seemed to linger, settling into the corners like a stubborn shadow. She set out a bowl of water and an old dog bed near the window, careful not to crowd him. He paced the entryway, circling once, twice, before settling just out of reach, close enough to watch her, far enough to escape if he needed to. Meredith pretended not to notice, busying herself with unpacking groceries and humming tunelessly, letting him take the measure of the place on his own terms. She named him Dakota that night, after a town she'd passed through once, a name strong enough to carry the weight of his history, but soft enough to fit the new life she hoped he'd find here. She tried it out in a low, gentle voice as she set a plate of leftover roast chicken on the porch steps, sliding it just far enough away that he had to come closer if he wanted it. He eyed her, then the food, then back again, suspicion warring with hunger until, finally, he crept forward, took the chicken in his mouth, and retreated to the safety of the porch rail. That became their routine. Slow, patient dances around one another. In the mornings, Meredith would rise with the sun, coffee mug in hand, and sit on the porch steps, watching Dakota explore the overgrown yard. He sniffed the fence posts, marked the old sycamore, and sometimes just stood perfectly still, nose tilted into the wind, as if listening for something she couldn't hear. She resisted the urge to reach for him, to crowd him with affection or force him into the mold of the dogs she'd known as a child. Instead, she offered him silence, the gift of space, and a kind of understanding born from her own wounds. Loss had taught her that trust couldn't be hurried, it had to be built, one small kindness at a time. Some days she caught him watching her through the kitchen window, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Other days he followed her at a distance as she worked in the garden, pulling weeds and planting late-season tomatoes. Once she found him sitting beside her mother's old rocking chair, staring at the faded quilt draped over the arm. When she knelt down, he didn't move, just shifted his weight and let out a long, tired sigh. Gradually, Dakota began to let her in. On a hot July afternoon, Meredith found him sprawled under the porch, panting in the shade. She sat beside him, close but not touching, and began talking quietly about nothing in particular: the weather, a bird's nest she'd found, her plans to repaint the kitchen. After a while, she reached out with slow, deliberate movements and brushed her hand along his back. He flinched at first, but then relaxed, the tension in his shoulders melting beneath her touch. Every evening, she set out 2 plates on the porch, one for herself, one for Dakota. Sometimes they ate in silence, other times she filled the air with stories from her past, memories of Sam, tales from her days as an officer, dreams she'd almost forgotten she'd had. Dakota listened, always watchful, and sometimes when the sky faded to indigo and the cicadas began to sing, he would rest his head on her knee and close his eyes. The old farmhouse began to feel less empty. Meredith filled the rooms with music, opened the curtains to let in the light, and started hanging photographs on the walls, snapshots of wildflowers, sunrises over the fields, and eventually Dakota himself, captured in the golden hour glow as he patrolled the fence line. But not everything was easy. There were setbacks. One night, a thunderstorm rolled through, and Dakota bolted, squeezing through a gap in the fence and disappearing into the darkness. Meredith spent hours calling his name, flashlight beam cutting through the rain, heart pounding with the old familiar fear of loss. He returned at dawn, muddy and shaken, but unhurt. After that, she patched the fence and left the porch light burning all night, a beacon to guide him home. As summer deepened, their bond grew stronger, forged in the quiet rituals of daily life. Meredith brushed Dakota's fur every morning, careful of the old wounds, humming softly as she worked. She noticed how his coat began to shine, how the stiffness in his gait faded, how his eyes lost some of their haunted edge. They found a rhythm, 2 survivors learning to share the same space, the same grief, the same hope for something better. Dakota never barked, never begged, but he watched her with an intensity that made her believe he understood everything she'd lost, in everything she stood to gain. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields turned to gold, Meredith and Dakota sat together on the porch, side by side. She sipped her coffee. He rested his chin on her foot, and for the first time in a long time, the old farmhouse felt like home again. But beneath the peace, a question lingered, silent but insistent. What had happened to Dakota before he came to her? What ghosts still haunted his dreams? Meredith knew that healing was a slow, uncertain journey. But as she watched Dakota settle beside her, breathing deep and steady, she vowed that, whatever came next, they would face it together. August in Texas had a way of pressing the world flat. Every afternoon, the light thickened, heat rippling across the fields until even the cicadas gave up singing for a while. Inside the old farmhouse, Meredith kept the windows cracked for breeze, But it wasn't the sun or the stillness that weighed on her. It was the sense of being watched, quietly, patiently, from across the room. Dakota had claimed the patch of cool tile near the back door. He no longer avoided her touch, but neither did he seek it out. Some days he'd follow her through the kitchen, shadowing each step with a deliberate distance, as if reassuring himself she was real. Other times, he would lay beneath the window and gaze outside, ears pricked, nose twitching at the wind. There was something he was waiting for, she could tell, some old call or habit that still lived inside him. One morning, as she brushed Dakota's fur, gently working through the matted places along his shoulders, her fingers caught on something small and hard beneath the skin. She froze. A scar, nearly lost in the swirl of old injuries, ringed a tiny lump just below his left shoulder blade. Her heart thudded. She'd seen enough strays and rescues to recognize the familiar shape of a microchip. "Hey, easy boy," she murmured, voice steady even as her mind raced. She finished brushing him, then went to her office to dig out the old chip scanner she'd used back in her days with the sheriff's department. The routine felt both foreign and oddly natural. She returned, scanner in hand, crouched by Dakota's side, and gently pressed the device against his shoulder. The scanner beeped, a sharp, unmistakable sound. The display flashed a string of numbers. Meredith jotted it down, heart pounding, then searched the National Pet Registry database. The name that popped up made her stomach twist. Clint Booker. Address, a rural route outside of town. Status, inactive. She stared at the screen, trying to place the name, until it hit her like a blow to the gut. Booker had been the subject of an animal cruelty complaint nearly 3 years before. Meredith herself had been the responding officer. A neighbor had reported hearing chained dogs, night after night, and seeing smoke rising from behind the barn at odd hours. She remembered driving out, clipboard in hand, seeing Booker's ranch for the first time. Dusty, cluttered, the air sharp with the smell of old hay and something worse. There had been dogs on chains, eyes wary, bodies thin. But Booker had a plausible answer for everything. No bodies, no proof, no arrest. The case file closed for insufficient evidence. Dakota, she realized, had been there. He was one of those dogs. And maybe, just maybe, her failure to prove anything had let his suffering continue. Meredith felt guilt surge in her chest, hot and corrosive. She pressed her hands into her thighs to steady herself, fighting the urge to fall back into old regret. What good was guilt if it didn't change anything? She looked at Dakota, who lay watching her with his one good eye, alert and unblinking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have done more. I won't let you down again. Not this time." That night, as the crickets took over the fields and the sky turned dark blue, Meredith sat on the porch, a camera in her lap, wrestling with the weight of memory. She thought about how easy it was sometimes to turn away, to let a case go cold because the law demanded more than just a gut feeling. She remembered the look in Booker's eyes that day, cocky, almost taunting, like he knew the rules better than she did. Now, though, she had something real. She had Dakota. She had a chip, a scar, and the relentless pull of unfinished business. The idea of facing Booker again filled her with dread, but beneath it, as something else stirred, a flicker of resolve, the same stubbornness that had carried her through the worst years of her life. The next morning, Meredith made a plan. She would gather everything she could, photos, records, statements, anything that might shed light on what Dakota and those other dogs had endured. For the first time in months, her camera felt like more than a distraction. It was a tool, a witness. She charged the batteries, emptied the memory card, and made a mental list of every step she'd take. Meanwhile, Dakota watched her with a quiet, growing trust. He'd begun to follow her around the house, not just out of suspicion, but out of a need for company. In the evenings, as the sun slipped behind the barn, he would lie at her feet on the porch, head resting on his paws, ears turning to catch the slightest sound. If she stayed up late, reviewing old case files on her laptop, he'd move to the doorway, standing guard. One afternoon, she took him outside, and kneeling in the grass, snapped a photo of his face, half in shadow, one eye clear, the other cloudy but not blind. There was intelligence there, a stubborn fire that hadn't gone out. She printed the photo, tacked it to the wall above her desk, and stared at it whenever her resolve wavered. Meredith knew that bringing the truth to light would mean revisiting old wounds, not just Dakota's, but her own. She would have to call people she'd avoided, dig up files she'd tried to forget, and maybe even confront the men who'd made her doubt herself all those years ago. But when Dakota stood beside her, watching the fields as if standing guard against old ghosts, she found a strength she thought she'd lost. It was in the way he walked now, more confident, less haunted. It was in the way he accepted her touch, slow and tentative, but real. She promised herself, and Dakota, that this time she wouldn't look away. She would see it through, no matter how messy, no matter how much it hurt. The days stretched on, marked by their new rituals, long walks along the fence line, quiet meals on the porch, hours spent poring over old files and news clippings. Every so often, Dakota would press his nose to her palm. A gentle reminder that he was there, that he was real, that the past didn't have to define the future. But always, at the edge of her mind, the questions lingered. What had happened at Booker's ranch in those lost years? How many others had suffered unseen and unheard? And would she be strong enough, this time, to bring the truth into the light? As the summer waned and the fields faded from green to gold, Meredith and Dakota prepared for what was coming. Whatever lay beneath the scars, they would face it together. Mornings on the Lane farm began with dew and the soft clatter of coffee cups, but the air in early September was heavier, thick with the weight of questions that never seemed to sleep. Meredith stood at her kitchen window, watching the pale sun lift itself over tangled pasture. Dakota circled the yard, snout to the ground, tracing invisible trails only he understood. In the weeks since she'd discovered the microchip and the name Clint Booker, she'd barely slept, mind spinning with the possibilities, and the guilt that gnawed at her, old and fresh, all at once. She kept returning to the case file, thumbing through faded statements and dog-eared photographs, names, dates, accusations, no convictions, a sense of injustice baked into the pages. She remembered the desperate call from the neighbor, Mrs. Jacobs, who swore she'd heard whimpers at all hours. Meredith had done everything the law allowed, but at the end of the day, the sheriff's shrug and Booker's grin had been the only things left. That helplessness burned now, but it was Dakota, silent and watchful, who gave her purpose. When he pressed his head into her hand or curled at her feet by the porch swing, she felt the past shifting, demanding not just regret, but action. She decided she wouldn't be just a witness to his suffering anymore. This time, she would bring it into the light. She started with what she knew best, her camera. She snapped photos of Dakota's scars, of the way he limped, of the old chain marks hidden by fur. She framed each image not for beauty, but as evidence, cold and real. Every night she spread the prints across the dining room table, arranging them in patterns, looking for something she missed. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Meredith needed stories, testimony. She drove her battered Subaru down back roads until she reached a weathered house at the end of a dirt lane. The mailbox read, Rivers, a name she remembered from the original report. Mrs. Rivers had been a vet tech for decades, and when Meredith knocked, she was greeted by a woman with sharp eyes and a voice roughened by years of truth-telling. Meredith explained her reason for coming. Booker, the cruelty, the lost dogs, Dakota's chip. Mrs. Rivers didn't hesitate. That man was poison, she said, hands trembling as she poured coffee into thick mugs. I saw what he did to those animals. We all did. Nobody ever listened, least of all the law. They talked for hours. Mrs. Rivers pulled out old receipts, clinic notes, scribbled reminders of dogs brought in half dead, then claimed by men who lied about how the injuries happened. There was a box of faded Polaroids, snouts battered, eyes gone dull, collars with tags that never led anywhere. Meredith took photos of the photos, her stomach twisting with each new detail. But the pain wasn't just in the telling. It was in the remembering. There was a raid planned once, Mrs. Rivers said, voice cracking. You were supposed to be there. Then it got called off. I never understood why. After that, Booker moved his operation deeper into his land. Nobody got close again. Meredith felt the shame like a bruise. I tried, Mrs. Rivers. I really did. We just never had enough. The older woman shook her head, not unkindly. Not your fault, honey. That's on him. And all those who let him keep going. When she left, arms full of borrowed photos in a notebook crowded with names, Meredith felt Dakota waiting at the car. He sniffed her hand, tail swishing low, as if reading her exhaustion and sharing it. On the ride home, she talked to him, voice low and steady. We're getting closer. I promise you, we're not stopping this time. Back at the farmhouse, Meredith threw herself into work. She made calls to the old shelter director, retired but still sharp. She tracked down another neighbor who'd moved to Oklahoma, coaxing shaky recollections out of long-distance static. Some stories matched, some didn't. What mattered was the pattern. Too many dogs gone missing, too many stories ending with "Thaddeus, nobody did anything." In the evenings, Dakota's presence was less a comfort and more a partnership. He began to shadow her more closely, sleeping at the foot of her bed instead of by the door, following her out to the barn and back. Sometimes he startled at loud noises, and Meredith saw flashes of the old fear in his eyes. But he always returned to her, searching for reassurance, and each time she reached out, she found herself steadier for his trust. The house, too, changed. It filled with papers, photographs, folders stacked high. Evidence not just of cruelty, but of a long history of people trying and failing to save what they could. Meredith began to see her camera not just as a witness, but as a weapon, one that could finally force people to look. One evening, as dusk crept across the fields, she found herself on the porch with Dakota at her side, reviewing the day's progress. Her phone vibrated. A text from one of the old deputies she'd called earlier. "Check the files. There's more in storage. I'll let you in tomorrow." A thrill of hope flickered inside her. She stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. "Looks like we're not done yet, buddy." Dakota thumped his tail against the porch, eyes bright in the failing light. She smiled, heart aching with a mixture of hope and dread. That night, as the sky filled with stars, Meredith packed her camera bag with fresh batteries and extra memory cards. She pulled out an old notebook, writing down every name, every address, every loose end. Dakota lay nearby, his breathing slow and steady, but Meredith sensed the alertness beneath his calm, a shared readiness for whatever would come next. In the half-light of memory and ashes, two survivors sat watch, neither willing to let the past win. The investigation was no longer just about justice for a wounded dog or closure for a failed officer. It was about honoring every broken chain, every missed chance, every voice that had once cried out and gone unheard. Meredith closed her eyes, hand resting on Dakota's back. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we keep going, we keep fighting." Dakota didn't answer, but as the wind rattled the old fence, he pressed himself closer, silent and sure. In that moment, Meredith understood. This was what healing looked like. Not forgetting, but fighting back, side by side. Autumn crept across Weatherford with the first breath of cool wind, sharpening the edges of the night and painting the fields in faded gold. Meredith spent her days collecting stories and evidence, piecing together a case from fragments and scars. The farmhouse was more cluttered than ever, walls lined with photographs, maps littered with pushpins, pages of notes curling in the late sun. But the chaos felt purposeful now, a roadmap leading her and Dakota back to the truth. As the case grew, so did Meredith's obsession with Booker's Ranch. Every time she looked at Dakota, she pictured those old chains and battered pins. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about finally facing the ghosts she'd tried to bury and standing up for every animal who'd never gotten out. That night, As a thin crescent moon floated above the pasture, Meredith sat with Dakota on the porch, her mind spinning with a plan she'd rehearsed for days. The time had come to see Booker's property for herself, not just as a cop, not as a victim of guilt, but as someone determined to document the truth with her own eyes. She packed her camera bag with fresh batteries and a powerful flashlight, shoving her phone, fully charged and set to silent, into her back pocket. Dakota watched her with a quiet intensity, as if reading her resolve. She double-checked the lock on the front door, slipped on her old field boots, and knelt beside Dakota. "I need you tonight," she whispered. "I need you to help me see what I missed." They drove the back roads in near darkness, tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The Booker Ranch was a mile off the main highway, shielded by gnarled oak trees and a barbed wire fence that had grown wild with neglect. Meredith parked her Subaru in a shallow dip behind some scrub, heart pounding as she stepped out into the chill. Dakota slipped from the car like a shadow, hugging the fence line, every muscle taut with awareness. Meredith drew in a breath, steadying herself against the old familiar fear. They crept through a break in the wire, boots sinking into the muddy ground where heavy trucks had passed before. The air smelled of old hay, oil, and something deeper, a metallic tang she recognized from 100 crime scenes. They skirted the edge of the property, keeping low. Meredith's flashlight stayed off. Camera set to silent mode. Dakota paused by a broken gate, nose twitching at something unseen. Meredith followed, careful not to step on the fallen chains that tangled in the grass. She snapped a quick photo, bloodstains, black and ancient, painted across a tire chain still nailed to a stump. The sight made her stomach clench, and for a second she fought the urge to turn back. But Dakota moved forward, so she did too. Behind the barn, the earth was churned and scattered with bones. Old, weathered, chewed by time. Not just animal bones, Meredith realized, but collars and tags, bits of fabric and rope. She took pictures of everything, her hands shaking, but steady enough for the job. A sudden rustle made her freeze. Dakota pressed close to her thigh, ears pinned, eyes narrowed at the darkness beyond the barn. Meredith ducked, heart racing, and peered around the corner. Headlights flickered between the trees, a truck engine coughing to life with a low, threatening rumble. Someone was here. She ducked back, breath trapped in her chest. Dakota didn't bark, but his whole body tensed, ready to protect, ready to run. Meredith weighed her options in a heartbeat. If she was caught, the case could unravel. If she ran, she risked leaving a trail. She reached down, fingers curling around Dakota's collar. "Time to go," she mouthed. They slipped through the shadows, skirting the edge of the field. The truck's beams swept over the barn, illuminating the broken pins and the chain stump before swinging away. Meredith kept low, shoes slipping in the mud, camera hugged to her chest. Behind them, the truck idled, engine grumbling like an angry animal. A figure climbed out, silhouetted in the light. Meredith caught a glimpse of a broad frame, a familiar hat, and the unmistakable swagger of someone who felt untouchable. Even from a distance, she knew it was Booker. He kicked at something in the dirt, then turned toward the fence, scanning the darkness. For a terrifying moment, Meredith was sure he'd seen her. Dakota pressed closer, a low growl rumbling in his chest. She hushed him, backing away until the fence loomed just ahead. The barbed wire snagged her sleeve, tearing a thin line of fabric as she and Dakota scrambled through. On the other side, she dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. They ran, silent, desperate, until the ranch lights faded behind them. Only then did Meredith let herself stop, knees trembling as she leaned against Dakota for support. The fear was raw, but beneath it was a strange, electric sense of victory. She'd seen it for herself. She had the evidence. And this time, she had a witness who would never let her forget what she'd found. Back in the safety of the car, Dakota settled on the floor, panting and alert. Meredith's hands shook as she reviewed the photos, each one a grim testament to what had happened on that land. Bones, chains, blood, proof. On the drive home, neither of them spoke, but Meredith felt the bond between them tightening, two survivors, united by the promise that the truth would not be buried again. By the time they reached the farmhouse, dawn was just breaking, pale blue light slipping through the trees. Meredith collapsed onto the porch steps, Dakota curling beside her, exhausted but unbroken. She stared at the horizon, feeling the weight of what she'd uncovered. There would be consequences, she knew. Booker wouldn't give up easily, but as she ran her fingers through Dakota's fur, feeling the steady thump of his heart, she knew she was ready. She had come looking for closure. What she found was something fiercer, the courage to fight for the voiceless, no matter the cost. As the sun crested the fields, Meredith whispered to Dakota, "We're not running anymore. Whatever comes next, we face it together." And for the first time since she'd set foot back on the Lane farm, Meredith felt something like hope break through the fear. Fragile, stubborn, and as real as the dog who refused to leave her side, the air the next morning felt sharp, humming with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Meredith barely slept, replaying every detail of the night's trespass at Booker's ranch, her breath misting as she hunched over her laptop, organizing the photographs, sending copies to a trusted friend in law enforcement just in case. She paced the kitchen, Dakota never more than a few steps behind, his ears pricked at every sound. Even the morning sunlight, golden through the kitchen window, couldn't chase away the shadows clinging to her nerves. She'd crossed a line last night, and she knew it. Booker was dangerous, a man who'd gotten away with too much, too long. Still, she told herself, justice wasn't quiet. She ran her hand down Dakota's back, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I need you with me," she whispered, as if reminding them both. Dakota stayed by her side as she moved through her morning, always alert. At the mailbox, Meredith glanced up and down the dirt road, heart skipping when a black pickup appeared in the distance. It rumbled past, slow and heavy, windows tinted too dark to read the driver. She caught a flash of a familiar hat. A chill trickled down her spine. Booker knew. Meredith went inside, double-checking the locks and pulling the curtains. For the first time since moving back, she felt truly hunted. But she didn't let herself freeze. She grabbed her phone, speed-dialed her contact at the sheriff's department. Voicemail? She left a message anyway, voice low and controlled. "I have new evidence on Booker. If anything happens to me or Dakota, check the folder I sent you. Please call back." The rest of the day passed in fragments, checking the windows, Dakota's steady presence, every thud outside making her pulse leap. She rehearsed what she'd do if someone came, call for help, barricade the door, stay calm. But by evening, a strange hush settled, the world holding its breath. She tried to work, sorting the raw through photographs and case notes, but her mind kept drifting to the edge of fear. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the roof, and Dakota's gaze tracked every shift of shadow. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised indigo, Meredith set out Dakota's dinner on the porch. He barely touched it. She sat on the porch swing, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching the empty drive. Dakota pressed close to her legs, tense as a drawn bow. Somewhere, a dog barked in the distance. The farmhouse felt both fortress and prison. Then, in the deep blue dark, headlights swept over the yard. No engine, just the ghostly beam of someone's flashlight. Meredith stood, her heart in her throat. Dakota's fur bristled, a low growl vibrating in his chest, a crunch of gravel, too close. A figure moved through the trees at the edge of the property, purposeful, silent. Meredith's hand found the panic button she'd had installed. A silent alarm connected directly to the sheriff's department, meant for emergencies only. Her thumb hovered, waiting. Dakota's growl deepened. Suddenly, a shadow detached from the darkness. A man, big, broad-shouldered, face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. He advanced, quicking, boots thudding on the porch boards. "Get out here, Lane." The voice was unmistakable. Clint Booker, venom sharp in every word. "You think you're clever, sneaking around my land?" Meredith stood her ground, hand shaking. I called the police, Clint. Leave now. Booker sneered. You always were soft. Thought you could ruin me? You don't know a damn thing. He took another step. Dakota surged forward, teeth bared, body between Meredith and Booker. Booker raised a crowbar, swinging at Dakota. The blow landed with a sickening thud, but Dakota barely faltered. He lunged, snapping his jaws inches from Booker's hand. Blood blossomed on Booker's knuckles. Meredith pressed the panic button hard, heart hammering. The alarm's silent signal sped out to the county dispatcher. Booker cursed, swinging again, this time catching Dakota along the ribs. Dakota yelped but stood firm, every hair raised. Get back, Meredith screamed, her voice raw. The police are coming. For a moment, everything froze. Booker staring at Dakota, Dakota holding the line, Meredith's finger white on the panic button. Then, distant sirens split the silence, blue and red lights flashing down the road. Booker turned to run, but Dakota lunged, catching his pant leg, dragging him down. Booker kicked wildly, struggling to his feet, but the sounds of approaching law enforcement, gravel flying, doors slamming, men shouting, cut through the night. 2 deputies burst onto the porch, weapons drawn. On the ground! Now! Booker hesitated, then dropped the crowbar, falling to his knees, cursing under his breath. Dakota limped back to Meredith, sides heaving, blood streaking his fur. Meredith dropped to her knees, pulling him close, hands trembling as she checked his wounds. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. He was hurt, but alive. He'd saved her. The deputies cuffed Booker, dragging him to the patrol car. One deputy, a woman Meredith recognized from her old department, knelt beside her. Are you all right? Meredith nodded, voice breaking. Dakota needs a vet. Please. And get the evidence from my email. Everything you need is there. The deputy nodded, already calling for an animal control unit and backup. Meredith pressed her forehead to Dakota's, whispering thanks and apologies. You're my hero. You hear me? We're safe. We're safe. As the law descended on the farmhouse, flashing lights, radios crackling, neighbors gathering in the shadows, Booker shouted one last threat, face twisted with rage. You should have stayed retired, Lane. This ain't over. But Meredith only held Dakota tighter, drawing strength from the battered, loyal dog who had stood between her and the darkness. The deputies took her statement, gathered evidence, and promised her Booker would be charged with trespassing, assault, and, thanks to her photographs and Dakota's chip, animal cruelty. Hours later, when the chaos faded and the last cruiser rolled away, Meredith sat on the porch steps, Dakota's head in her lap. She cleaned his wounds with gentle hands, murmuring promises into his fur. He watched her with the same steady, unblinking faith. In the quiet, under a sky scattered with stars, Meredith realized something had changed forever. She was no longer haunted by what she hadn't done. She had fought. Dakota had fought. And together, they had survived. Whatever came next, courtrooms, questions, the long road to healing, they would walk it side by side. The days after the attack passed in a strange, suspended haze. Meredith drifted between exhaustion and a kind of steely purpose. Every time she tended Dakota's wounds, dabbing medicine along the bruised ribs where Booker's crowbar had struck, checking the stitches the vet had put in after the fight, she was reminded of what they had survived. The farmhouse was quieter now, but there was a new energy running beneath the surface, the sense that an ending, or maybe a reckoning, was coming. Dakota healed quickly, more quickly than she expected. Within a week, he was back on his feet, limping at first, then moving with his familiar watchful grace. He rarely left Meredith's side, sleeping at her feet, following her from room to room. If a car pulled onto the gravel road, he was the first to the window, body tense but eyes unafraid. There was a confidence in him now, as if something had shifted deep inside, no longer just a survivor, but a protector, a witness. The sheriff's department moved fast. With Meredith's evidence, the photos from Booker's ranch, the microchip data, the testimony of the old vet techs and neighbors, Booker faced a raft of charges. The media caught wind of the story, eager for a tale of cruelty and redemption in small-town Texas. Reporters called, cameras waited by the courthouse, and Meredith found herself pulled into a world she'd once sworn she'd left behind, the world of testimony and cross-examination, of truth being weighed out, piece by piece, in front of strangers. The courthouse in Weatherford was older than Meredith remembered. Thick stone walls, heavy wooden doors, ceiling fans that never seemed to move the air enough. On the first day of the trial, she dressed in her old suit, hands steady on Dakota's collar as they crossed the parking lot. She felt the stares of the gathered crowd, neighbors, journalists, the curious, and the skeptical alike. Most of all, she felt Dakota's silent support, his presence grounding her as she stepped into the echoing hallway. The trial opened with a litany of charges: trespassing, assault, animal cruelty. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision, every photograph and piece of testimony building a narrative that was impossible to ignore. The microchip, the chain scars, the blood on Booker's property, each detail became a nail in the coffin of his defense. When Meredith took the stand, the courtroom stilled. She told her story, how she'd found Dakota at the auction, the memories of the old case she'd been forced to close, the night she risked everything to return to Booker's ranch. Her voice never wavered, even when she recounted the fear in Dakota's eyes or the rage in Booker's. The defense tried to rattle her, suggesting she'd trespassed, that she'd acted out of personal vendetta. But Meredith held her ground. She spoke for Dakota, for the other dogs who hadn't made it, and for every person who'd ever been told their instincts didn't matter. The most powerful moment came when Dakota was led into the courtroom. The judge had allowed it, recognizing the dog's role as both victim and witness. The room fell silent as Dakota padded to Meredith's side, sitting tall and calm, gaze steady as stone. He bore his scars openly, fur still patchy along his ribs, but there was no fear in him. Instead, there was a dignity that drew everyone's eyes. The jury watched as Dakota rested his chin on Meredith's knee, the two of them side by side, a living testament to survival. The prosecution introduced other victims too, people who had lost dogs to Booker's cruelty, who'd always wondered what became of them. Some were old, voices quavering as they recalled sleepless nights, listening to cries from across the fields. Others brought photos, scraps of collars, faded Polaroids of dogs that never came home. The weight of their testimony filled the room, a tide of grief and rage and hope. Booker sat stone-faced, but every so often his composure cracked. A sneer, a muttered curse, a glare at Meredith that seemed to say, "You'll regret this." She met his gaze, unflinching, feeling Dakota's warmth at her side. The days of being silenced, of looking away, were over. As the trial dragged on, the story spread beyond the courthouse. News vans crowded Main Street, volunteers from rescue groups flooded the shelter with donations. People came forward with stories of their own: neglected animals, overlooked cases, small injustices that suddenly mattered again. On the final day, Meredith was called back to the stand for closing statements. She spoke quietly, but her words rang clear. Sometimes cruelty hides in plain sight. Sometimes justice takes too long, but she paused, looking at Dakota. This is what happens when you refuse to look away. This is what survival looks like. The judge's verdict came in the late afternoon. The sunlight streaming through the high courthouse windows. Guilty on every count. Booker's sentence was swift and public, a warning to anyone who thought silence would protect them. When the gavel fell, the tension in Meredith's chest loosened at last. She knelt beside Dakota, hugging him as cameras flashed, tears of relief and triumph blurring her vision. Around them, the crowd murmured, some weeping openly, others clapping or simply watching in quiet awe. As they left the courthouse, the air felt lighter, cleaner. Reporters shouted questions, but Meredith ignored them, focusing only on Dakota and the road ahead. They walked together through the crush of people. Two survivors, battered but unbroken, proof that evil can be dragged into the daylight. The story would travel far beyond Weatherford. But for Meredith and Dakota, justice wasn't just a verdict. It was a beginning, a chance to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. And as they reached the car, Dakota leapt into the passenger seat without hesitation, looking up at her with that old, steady gaze. Meredith smiled, heart full, and whispered, "We did it. We really did it." In that moment, for the first time in a long time, the world felt safe. With the trial behind them, autumn in Weatherford took on a new kind of light. For the first time since returning to the Lane farmhouse, Meredith found herself breathing deeper, walking through each day with a sense of possibility instead of dread. The darkness that had haunted every corner, her guilt, the silence about Booker's crimes, the ache of grief for Sam, began to fade, replaced by the relentless hope of beginning again. But the story of Dakota and the scars he carried didn't end with the gavel's fall. It only pointed Meredith toward a new purpose. The idea for Dakota's Haven came to her in the quiet after the verdict. When she looked at Dakota and saw it not just a survivor, but a symbol of something bigger, a need that went far beyond the walls of her home. The world was full of broken animals and broken people, she realized, each waiting for someone to listen, to make a space for healing. The old barn on her family's land had stood empty for years, filled with dust and memories. Now Meredith saw what it could be, a sanctuary. She threw herself into the work. The barn was sturdy, with thick beams and a slate roof that barely leaked. But it needed more than cleaning. Every nail she hammered and board she replaced was a promise to the future. Friends and neighbors pitched in, some from the rescue groups who'd followed Dakota's trial, others from town who remembered Meredith as a child. They carried lumber, fixed gates, ran power from the main house. Someone donated a fresh sign, hand-painted with bold, hopeful letters, Dakota's Haven. Dakota watched the transformation with his usual solemn intensity. He wandered the edges of the project, tail waving slow and low, greeting every visitor with a cautious sniff and the steady gaze that had so moved the courtroom. He seemed to sense the importance of this new task. When the first battered kennel arrived, holding a trembling beagle rescued from a hoarder's trailer, Dakota sat at the entrance, head cocked, as if introducing himself. "You're safe here now." The first few weeks were hard. Meredith had expected that. Healing, she'd learned, is never a straight line. The dogs that came to Dakota's Haven bore their own invisible wounds. Some hid beneath their beds, flinching at the sound of boots on gravel. Others snapped and barked at any hand reaching through the bars. There were nights when the air was thick with howls, and Meredith would sit in the hayloft, arms around her knees, wondering if she was in over her head. But Dakota changed everything. His presence alone seemed to calm the others. He moved slowly among the kennels, never pushing, never crowding. He lay beside the ones who couldn't sleep, pressed his nose through the wire to touch the trembling, silent ones. When a new arrival panicked and tried to claw through the gate, Dakota simply sat across from him, patient, until the storm passed. Over time, the other dogs watched him, and one by one began to trust again. Meredith witnessed small miracles every day. She saw a one-eyed terrier, terrified of men, creep out for a drink when Dakota was near. She watched an old hound with arthritis follow Dakota around the pasture. Their gaits matched in mutual pain and mutual endurance. There was even a three-legged shepherd, Emma, who, after days of hiding, finally let Meredith brush her matted coat when Dakota lay down beside her, tail thumping encouragement. The local paper ran a story about Dakota's Haven, complete with photographs of the dogs, the barn, and Meredith herself, smiling, tired, surrounded by animals that had survived horrors most people couldn't imagine. Donations trickled in, bags of kibble, crates, blankets, even a small grant from an animal welfare group in Dallas. A retired vet volunteered a few hours each week. Meredith set up a schedule, learning to juggle the chaos of feeding, cleaning, vet visits, and paperwork. But the most profound changes weren't in the barn. They were in Dakota himself. The scars along his side had faded, replaced by new fur, soft and golden in the sunlight. He gained muscle, moving with a confidence that Meredith had never seen before. He began to play, chasing a battered tennis ball around the yard, leaping awkwardly, but joyfully. Every so often, when the breeze carried the scent of distant fields, he'd sit in the grass and simply watch, ears forward, a sentinel for all that was good and safe. Meredith felt herself healing alongside him. She worked harder than she ever had, body aching by nightfall, hands calloused, mind often racing with doubts. But each time she saw a frightened dog accept a treat or curl up in a patch of sunlight, she knew she was on the right path. She started taking photographs again, not as evidence, but as celebration. A puppy's first wag, Dakota dozing among the others, a sunrise lighting up the barn with gold. She filled the farmhouse with these pictures, hanging them over the kitchen table and along the stairwell. The house was no longer a mausoleum for memories, but a gallery of resilience, a place where past pain was acknowledged, but honored, and finally transformed. By winter, Dakota's haven was full. There were young dogs and old purebreds and mutts, all united by survival and the hope of a second chance. Some stayed only a short while before being adopted. Others needed more time, or maybe a forever home right here. Dakota remained their anchor, their quiet leader, the first to greet new arrivals, and the last to leave the yard at night. Sometimes, on cold evenings, Meredith would sit on the porch with Dakota at her feet, watching the lights glowing in the barn. She thought of the night she'd found him at the auction, battered and silent, just another lost soul in need of saving. Now he was the heart of something larger, proof that even the deepest wounds could be the beginning of a new story. And when the other dogs cried out in the dark, Dakota walked among them, calm and sure, offering the only thing that mattered, the assurance that, in this place, no one was alone. Winter in Texas was always a strange, shifting thing. A cold wind one day, a warm sun the next, the fields flickering between frost and muddy gold. For Meredith, these days at Dakota's Haven took on a kind of quiet magic. Every morning, she woke to the sound of barking, paws dancing across the barn floor, and Dakota's steady gaze, waiting to greet her at the door. The sanctuary was full now, humming with life and stories, each dog carrying their own scars, each one learning, slowly, that healing was possible. Word of the place had spread further than Meredith imagined. People drove in from hours away to meet the dogs. Some came to adopt, others just to see the place that had become something of a legend, a patch of hope on the edge of Weatherford. Volunteers showed up regularly, helping with feeding and cleaning, playing fetch in the fields, brushing tangled coats. Yet, despite all the visitors, there were moments that stood out, moments when Meredith saw something shift, something she knew she would remember forever. It happened on a windy Saturday morning as a pale sun crept above the horizon and frost lingered on the porch rail. Meredith was setting out food bowls when she heard the crunch of gravel. She looked up to see an unfamiliar car inching its way down the lane, dust swirling around the tires. The car parked and two adults stepped out, a woman and a man, both dressed in careful layers, the kind of neat, practical clothes that spoke of city life. In the back seat, a small boy sat staring out the window, unmoving. Meredith wiped her hands on her jeans and walked out to greet them. The woman's smile was polite but anxious. "Hi, we're the Wessons. We called yesterday about maybe meeting some of your dogs for our foster son." She nodded toward the boy who hadn't moved. Meredith smiled. "Of course, you're welcome to walk around, meet anyone who's interested in meeting you." She crouched, peering into the car. "Hi there, I'm Meredith." The boy, no more than 8, with dark hair hanging over his eyes, barely nodded. The man gently opened the door and tried to coax him out. "Come on, Josh, let's go see the dogs." The boy slid out, small and silent, arms wrapped around himself. His eyes were wary, his posture folded in on itself. Aunt Meredith led the family through the barn, introducing them to the dogs one by one. Some barked, eager and loud. Others shied away, hiding behind beds or curling into corners. Josh didn't reach for any of them. He kept his hands in his pockets, shrinking away when a particularly excitable puppy tried to lick his fingers. The Wessons traded nervous glances. Meredith recognized the signs. The careful distance, the flinching from touch. She'd seen it before, in her own reflection and in every animal that arrived at Dakota's Haven. Dakota watched from his usual post by the door, observing the newcomers with the calm, steady presence he was known for. Meredith met his gaze, then quietly called to the family. "There's one more you should meet. He's our oldest resident, and the reason this place exists." She crouched beside Dakota, resting her hand on his back. Dakota, this is Josh. Dakota rose, his movement slow and deliberate. He approached Josh not as a dog, eager for affection, but as an equal, quiet, gentle, curious. He stopped a few feet away, then sat, his head tilted just so, waiting. Josh's parents watched, hopeful but uncertain. The barn was suddenly silent. Meredith waited, barely breathing. After a long moment, Josh shuffled forward, a single hesitant step. Dakota didn't move, didn't bark. He simply watched the boy, his own posture relaxed and patient. Josh stopped within arm's reach, his eyes never leaving Dakota's. For a long time, nothing happened. Meredith felt the tension in the air, the whole barn holding its breath. Then, in a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed, Josh reached out. His hand hovered, uncertain, before settling lightly on Dakota's head. Dakota closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. The boy's shoulders relaxed, just a little. He stroked Dakota's fur, slow and careful, as if learning the texture of safety. He's soft, Josh whispered, voice raspy from disuse. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. The man blinked hard, smiling. Meredith felt her own throat tighten. Dakota shifted closer, gently pressing his side against Josh's legs. The boy didn't flinch. He bent down, wrapping his arms around Dakota's neck, and for the first time, smiled. A small, shy thing, but real. He's like me, Josh said quietly, voice barely more than a breath. He came back. No one spoke for a while. The barn felt warmer, lighter, as if the morning sun had finally found its way inside. Around them, the other dogs settled, sensing the change. Meredith crouched beside the pair, meeting Josh's eyes. That's right. Dakota knows what it's like to be hurt, but he's not afraid anymore, and he's here to help anyone who needs it. Mm-hmm. The Wessons sat with Josh and Dakota for nearly an hour, asking questions, learning Dakota's story. Josh spoke more as time went on, his voice gaining strength with every word. He talked to Dakota as if the dog understood everything, and Meredith had no doubt that he did. When it was time to leave, Josh knelt and hugged Dakota once more, whispering something only the dog could hear. The Wessons promised to return soon, already filling out adoption paperwork for one of the gentler dogs. As they drove away, in us ears, Meredith watched Josh's face pressed to the window, smiling, Dakota's fur still clinging to his shirt. That night, as Meredith and Dakota walked the perimeter of the pasture beneath a pale, rising moon, she thought of all the broken things in the world, dogs and people alike, and how sometimes the most wounded souls are the ones who teach us to hope again. She reached down, brushing her hand through Dakota's fur. You saved him, you know, she murmured. Just like you saved me. Dakota looked up at her, eyes soft as if he understood. In the dark, the sanctuary glowed with quiet life, a barn full of second chances, a house full of memories finally finding peace. And outside, a boy and a dog who'd found in each other the courage to come back. The Texas sky stretched wide and endless over Dakota's haven as winter softened into spring, the light growing warmer, the nights gentler, and the world shifting back to life. The farmhouse, once heavy with memories and silence, had become the beating heart of the sanctuary, a place where people and animals alike learned to breathe easy again. Every morning, Meredith stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching Dakota pace the yard. He had become the quiet guardian of the place, moving with calm assurance along the fence lines, checking every corner as if he could personally guarantee that nothing bad would ever cross the borders again. His gait was steady now, scars faded beneath thick, healthy fur. He greeted each new sunrise with a low, satisfied rumble, the kind of contentment that came from finally belonging somewhere. The barn was busy with life. Dogs barked and played in the open yard. Volunteers arrived with treats and new toys, and sometimes children visited to sit in the grass with the gentler residents. Meredith had learned every routine by heart, the rhythm of feeding, the cycles of cleaning, the ways each dog told their story in movement and glance. Dakota always seemed to know which dog needed comfort, Which one wanted to be left alone? Which volunteer was feeling lost or overwhelmed? Sometimes, on slow afternoons, Meredith found herself leaning against the porch railing, just watching Dakota do what he did best. Not chasing, not barking, just being present. She realized that his greatest gift wasn't his strength or courage, but his simple, unwavering watchfulness. He stood where he was needed, silent but solid, an anchor for any soul drifting too close to fear. One evening, as the sun burned gold over the pasture, a small group gathered at Dakota's Haven for an open house. Neighbors, old friends, even a few families who had adopted dogs from the sanctuary. Josh and his foster parents were there too, the boy brighter now, laughing as he tossed a ball for Dakota. Other children trailed behind, finding comfort in the gentle confidence of the dog, who had once been afraid of everything. Meredith set out lemonade and cookies, accepting hugs and handshakes from people who had watched her journey from grief to purpose. She listened to their stories, smiled at their gratitude, but what moved her most was how many times she heard the same thing. This place changed us, not just the dogs, us too. But after the sun set and the last visitors drove away, Meredith found herself alone on the porch. The land was quiet, only the soft rustle of wind in the trees and the distant murmur of the barn. Dakota lay at her feet, chin resting on her boot, eyes trained on the horizon. She thought back over everything, the first day at the auction, the fear and uncertainty, the long nights filled with doubt, the moments when it seemed like the world would never heal. She remembered the bruised silence after Sam's death, the way she had wandered through the old farmhouse, haunted by questions and regrets. And she remembered the day she found Dakota, how something wordless and urgent had pulled her to him, insisting she not look away. Now, with the past behind her and hope rooted firmly in the present, Meredith understood. Rescue was never about fixing what was broken. It was about standing watch, about bearing witness, about holding space for healing to happen on its own time. Some wounds would never vanish, but here, surrounded by kindness and patience, they could become part of something beautiful. Dakota stirred, ears flicking as the night deepened. Meredith scratched behind his ears, her voice soft. "You don't have to do it all, you know. You've done enough." He huffed, leaning his weight into her, eyes closed in perfect trust. She looked out across the fields, moonlight silvering the grass, and felt peace settle into her bones. She saw, not for the first time, that life had circled back to give her a purpose far greater than the one she'd lost. Dakota's Haven was more than a shelter. It was a promise, a vow that no matter how dark things got, there would always be someone standing watch, refusing to let the world's cruelty win. In the final hush of evening, Meredith's thoughts turned inward, searching for the lesson in everything they had endured. She realized it wasn't just about survival or justice or even forgiveness. It was about the quiet strength that comes from simply refusing to give up, the courage to keep showing up, to stand guard, to love fiercely and without condition, even when it hurts. As she stood, the farmhouse light behind her and the sanctuary before her, Meredith spoke, not to Dakota, not even to herself, but to the world that was listening somewhere beyond the fence lines. He doesn't bark. He doesn't chase. He just stands where he's needed. That's all the strength some souls need. Dakota lifted his head, eyes bright with a wisdom that needed no words. And as the stars blinked awake over Weatherford, the Lane farmhouse and its patchwork barn glowed with the quiet radiance of a place that had become both refuge and home, a place where standing watch was the greatest act of love, and where hope, like the dawn, always found a way back.